Welcome to Triumphs and Limitations of DNA Forensics, aka putting some science back into our science fiction. I am Steve Setzer, I'm the moderator of the panel, and with me is Cedar Sanderson, who has a large amount of knowledge in this area and a lot to bring, and so I'm going to ask her to introduce herself a little bit. I'm just here because I moderate well, and I went to law school once upon a time.
That's an achievement by itself, really.
Right, but I've never actually had to apply forensic evidence.
So I actually haven't had to apply forensic evidence either. My name is Cedar Sanderson. I am an author and artist, and by day I am a scientist. 2 years ago, I graduated with a degree in forensic science and investigation. It's actually all one thing, that whole long bit. And while I had originally intended to go to work in a forensic lab, it turns out that there's a lot of networking there, and if you don't know somebody that already works there, it probably isn't going to happen. So what I do now is I work in quality control in the pharmaceutical industry, where it turns out there's actually some really interesting forensic applications, and I actually do DNA work as far as looking at the materials that we develop our drug from. So while I'm not doing it on a forensic level, criminology has been a big interest of mine for a long time, and I write mystery and I try to write realistic science based on what I know from my degree and my research that I've done for things into what I'm writing, because CSI is fiction in so many ways.
So let's toss that question out, because that is kind of a common ground. Most of us have seen at least an episode or two. Some of us watch too many cop shows while traveling for business and there's nothing else to do. So tell us, what's the biggest misconception that viewers get from a show like CSI?
I would say that there's a couple of major misconceptions, and by the way, this actually plays into real life, because there's now, law enforcement calls it the CSI effect. So when they're presenting evidence to a jury, the jury expects it to be like something that you'd see on CSI, and because it's not, it actually is affecting juries and trial outcomes. So it has a very real effect in the real world that is sometimes unfortunate, because probably the biggest misconception is that DNA testing is not fast. In an hour-long TV show, you get your results back within that hour. And when I run PCR, polymerase chain reaction, which is how you amplify a tiny bit of DNA into enough DNA that you can actually look at the details and get the information that you want to get from it. When I run PCR in the lab, it's a 2-day process. And it is a very finicky test. It's all about the pipetting. If you do not have steady hands, you will contaminate it, and then you have to throw it out and do it again. On top of this, I'm just going to go with a quick example from Ohio, where I live. They recently announced that they have a 40,000 case backlog on rape kits to test for DNA at the crime labs there for BCI. That is a lot of material. That is probably years of cases where they're waiting to get these results, which might catch a bad guy, but it's been years. And this offender may be out there doing the same thing that got this evidence collected in the first place. So it's a really rough situation that people are like, oh, CSI shows it, it's like, bang, it's done in an hour. But that's what we should expect. And the reality is it's not a quick test, and labs are extremely backlogged, which brings me to the other thing with DNA, and CSI, you see them DNA test everything, just all the things. I mean, I know most of the cases on CSI are murder, and realistically you will see DNA testing when you have that evidence in a murder case. Where you will not see DNA testing is a robbery. a smash and grab. Nobody's going to DNA test that evidence. There might be DNA evidence at the scene, but law enforcement agencies don't have the budget for it, and they're not going to pull the lab away from those 40,000 backlogged cases to do somebody's burglary case.
I just did a quick bit of math. At 2 days per case, assuming they don't mess up and have to restart, a single CSI can do 125 rape kits in a year. So to do 40,000 and get them done in a year, you'd probably have to hire more forensics graduates than there are in the country that year.
It is entirely possible. And the thing is that as far as forensic scientist goes, it's an extremely broad field. That's actually why I chose that degree. Because yes, I would have liked to have gone into law enforcement, work in the forensics lab, but forensic science is literally all the fields of science. So that incorporates arson investigation, that incorporates ballistics, blood spatter, it's the DNA, it's all the physical evidence, paint chips, and all of the little things that we can use as evidence for solving cases. So forensic scientists, as they graduate, are going into all these different fields. So they're not all going to do DNA testing. That requires the molecular biology subset. Now, I had a minor in molecular biology, so I had actually done PCR in school. A lot of forensic scientists don't.
So let me toss a couple of questions at that, because the great thing about writing science fiction and fantasy is that limits are plot points. This, you kind of put, at least for us talking about near-term science fiction and fantasy writing, you kind of put forth a plot point limitation right there, in that we're not likely to see it in anything other than a really important case, like a murder. Or if you can find some other reason, I mean, obviously we're talking about a subset here where there's a reason why someone wants to investigate it. So if you want that in your story, you probably want to elevate the reason for it, like it's not an ordinary burglary, it's a burglary at the National Security Agency. Someplace where they would have a reason to elevate it to that cause. Let me, boy, I've got like 4 different directions I want to go here, but I want to toss this one at you. Is there, I mean, we've all lived from, let me look through this room. Yeah. Even the youngest people in this room, when you were born, this was a dream. Okay? This beats the stuffing out of the first computer I ever owned so badly it's not even funny. And that computer was, this big.
It's the stuffing out of the computer they used to send the man to the moon.
Right. And so, are we seeing technological advancement, automation in either PCR, or are there alternate ways of analyzing DNA?
There are, and there actually are some really exciting things that are going on right now. So as part of my kind of trying to keep my feet wet in the field and the genre, I listen to some podcasts, and there's an excellent one that's run by a couple of forensic scientists called Criminology. And they're...
Time out. Write that down. Podcast Criminology.
I cannot remember their names off the top of my head. I'm terrible with names and it's horrible. But so I was listening to them talk about this, and I knew about some of what they were talking about, but they got into it in a depthful level that I had not gotten into, and I got super excited about it. So how many of you guys have heard about the Golden State Killer case? So yeah, okay. So they caught him using forensic genealogy. And there's a huge misconception that the law enforcement agency accessed something like 23andMe or Ancestry.com and got those results. They did not. They used an open source genealogy resource where people have actually uploaded their own DNA markers, not the entire genomic readout, but enough that they could use to be ancestral markers. And people do this, and it's actually available to the public, which is how the law enforcement agencies accessed it. And I'll get into a minute why they did this way, and why you don't have to worry about them trying to break into one of the other private agencies. But so they used, it's a site called JED Match, GED Match, and it's a genealogy database that one guy started because he was trying to figure out his family tree, and then he put it out as a resource. So they were able to find likely familiar matches to the Golden State Killer because they had DNA evidence from the scenes. And through that, they were able to narrow it down to this one guy, and they surveilled him, and they collected properly discarded DNA evidence. They didn't steal it or gain it through illegal means, and again, I'll get to that in a minute, and it's something you might even know about with your law background. And they were able to definitively, by the time they arrested him, they had the DNA tests, they knew, I mean, it took months to do all of this, but they knew that he was their guy because of the DNA. And that's like this, and they've used JED Match now for multiple cases. The podcast goes over 6 or 7 different cases that they've used JED Match to solve. And it's not just catching killers, they're also using it to find the relatives of unknown victims. So there was a body kit found, and because she was wearing a buckskin jacket, she was dubbed Buckskin Doe. They were able to find her family and identify her, and finally, after I think it was 37 years, let her mother know what had happened to her. So this is this amazing technological thing that we can do to use the forensic genealogy, to use the DNA, not just to catch killers, but also to identify victims and give families closure. The other thing that they touched on in the podcast that I actually knew about already was genomic phenotyping. So there's actually some really cool archaeological things. This is where I first heard about it. Is they took a prayer book that was owned by a man in a Dutch man in like the 16th century. And back in the day, when you said your prayers, you kissed your book. And it was part of the whole ritual of it. So they had this book that they knew had been owned by this one guy. So they very carefully collected DNA from the book where he had been kissing it. And they actually did this through using a pencil eraser. And I learned a new word, which I love because I'm a writer. So Urdu, E-R-D-U, is when you rub a pencil eraser across the paper and it has the little bits, the crumbs that are left, they're actually called Urdu. So, but they used the Urdu, they rubbed an eraser gently across this book, and they collected the Urdu and they extracted DNA from it, and they were able to come up with a portrait of what the man would have looked like, because they were able to use the genes to extrapolate the data for what his phenotype would have been. So brown eyes, brown hair, probably medium build, possibly stocky. So what they're doing now is there's a company called Parabon Nanolabs, and they are doing this phenotypes to actually take a killer's DNA and build a picture of what they might look like. It's not 100% yet, but we're getting better and better as the technology gets better. So it's just this fascinating thing of we can collect someone's DNA and we can basically get a picture of what they probably look like. And if they have some kind of odd genetic disorder, we might be able to figure that out and help. So those are the two big things that I found out about in this last year that are just like really fascinating, exciting stuff. And as far as me as an author, this is, if I take it and bring it out another generation of the technology, it gets scary level. But here's the thing with our current law enforcement laws and why they use the public domain things from JED Match, from JED Match to go after the Golden State Killer. There's something in law called the fruit of the poison tree. So if you collect evidence and you do it wrong, you do it illegally, and you get caught, and you probably will, because humans suck at keeping secrets, then the judge can declare that evidence and anything connected to it to be the fruit of the poison tree, and they will throw it out, and it will not be admissible in court. So if law enforcement were to improperly access private databases like 23andMe, Ancestry, the other things, it would become fruit of the poison tree, and anything that they used that information to collect would be thrown out of court. So while I know that there's some stuff going on, and it's definitely a concern, and they are selling the data, we know this. But as far as law enforcement goes right now, they can't just say, give me that information. That's not how it works. They need to have a warrant, and they need to have a proper cause for the seeking.
But they can subpoena it.
They can get a warrant for it, yes.
Right. So here, I'll come in here. With something like, here's the difference. With something like JED Match, the people have volunteered their data, and they have signed, accepted a license agreement that it's public, which means anyone can access it, including law enforcement. They don't need permission. When you sign up with Ancestry or 23andMe, you're granting it to them under contract, and the contract spells out what they're going to do, and they say in the contract they promised you that they're not going to hand it all over to law enforcement. Now, law enforcement can still get it if they have, fancy legal term, probable cause, meaning if they know there's a connection already, then they can ask anyone, 23andMe, Apple, Google, whoever has any kind of data on you, if they can make that connection, then they can show it. So, but typically they can't, and as she says, that fruit of the poison tree means if they do something wrong, everything that comes after it in that chain of evidence can be thrown out. Another thing, though, this goes back to the Golden State Killer. They had his original DNA from the bodies. So they knew what DNA they had, they didn't know who it was. When we talk about DNA, yeah, there's thousands of genes, each one made up of total of millions of codons in there. Mm-hmm. But there are patterns and there are markers that we can use to identify people. If I've got my report from Ancestry, 7% Amerindian and 42% French and so on. They can trace those down, and families, some of those run in. So they find the markers and then they compare it to all the ones that have been put into JED Match, and they find relatives of the person. Oh, we found 5 people who are all cousins of each other and are all, approximately 6 foot tall males. We're probably looking for a 6 foot tall male who's related to these people. And that's how they can narrow it down. Then they can go talk to those people and say, do you have a 6 foot tall relative in San Francisco that you've lost track of? Other thing, once they identify a target, now they have to say, oh, that guy. They can't just go up and swab his DNA or make him give it up. Watch this. Okay, I took a drink. This belongs to me. The police can't take it from me. Anyone can pick that up, including a police officer, and do anything they want to with it, because I have thrown it away. Your garbage is in the public domain. And so that's why you see in the movies the trick where they'll serve someone a glass of wine and then they'll take it back. If you've got something to hide, don't accept a glass of wine or orange juice or whatever you like from anybody.
And there are documented cases where the cops borrowed the garbage men's uniforms and were the ones riding down the street collecting trash cans and being very careful about what they did with that particular trash can. So they can get pretty sneaky to collect stuff that they can't collect, but they're also very careful not to get into the poison tree because they don't, if the case is important to them, they don't want to lose the person that they're after. So they are going to try their best to do everything by the book. So, and yes, I know that there's always bad apples. And the justice system has serious flaws. I've written papers on the plea bargaining system. But overall, they are trying to be.
The other thing to remember, too, that we grew up in an environment, and so we're used to a legal environment with cups and so on, with the exclusion rule, where evidence collected improperly is excluded. Not every country, not every society has that. The United States, it's not required. The Supreme Court has said themselves, it's not required, it's the enforcement mechanism we're going to use. But Congress or a state legislature, as long as they came up with some alternative way, like fining the individual cop or something, could actually come up with a system where you didn't have an exclusionary rule, and therefore there was no fruit of the poison tree, and they could collect it any way they wanted. And that is true in other countries and in other law enforcement systems. So.
And as a writer, that's also something that you get to decide for your particular culture. If you're writing fantasy or science fiction with advanced technology, what are the law enforcement rules in your particular culture? Also, I mean, one of the interesting things that I learned in criminal justice classes is that there's something like 19,000 different agencies, police forces, and this and that and the other thing all across the United States. And they all have their own little particular quirks and differences and different laws in different places. So you can get very complex very quickly. And you find, I mean, certainly in the United States, there isn't one big overarching thing that regulates all of this.
Right. Whereas, again, if you're setting in another country, Japan tends to do things very centralized. They're not a totalitarian state or whatever, but they have one education ministry, they have one police ministry, and so they're very much more by the book, and there's a single book. And so you can play with that. You can even play with the fish out of water syndrome of someone from one context getting tripped up by the differences in another context.
Something I didn't touch on when I was talking about the JED Match and the Golden State Killer and everything is they're actually working with people whose job is to be forensic genealogists, which personally I think is like an amazing job to have, but there's only a few of them in the world right now. It's actually something I think we're going to see more people becoming that. But they're helping, because the whole thing of tracing through the ancestry, any of you that have done any kind of genealogy work, you know how complicated that is. So these people they were usually genealogists and quite good at it, and now they're working at the forensic end of it as well, and it's different nuances, and they kind of have to learn the rules that they have to play by. So I've actually thought that would be a fun character to create for a book, and write a book from the perspective of a forensic genealogist that's trying to track down and maybe getting a little too close for comfort. So I like to read thrillers too.
I'm imagining somebody's spunky grandmother in that role.
Listen, they interviewed someone on the podcast, and she sounded like somebody's spunky grandmother. So
that's awesome.
It is.
So let's a lot of the questions that they suggested, and I'm not necessarily going off of those, were very near term.
Yes.
But I'll toss a couple out. You started to allude to contamination.
Yes.
Tell us about the kinds of contamination and how you prevent them, and then maybe give us some story ideas about intentional contamination.
So I think as far as from a forensic perspective, probably the most classic case of, and I think it even made it onto a CSI episode, but there's a classic case of they got DNA results back from a case and they weren't what they expected, and they tracked it down, and the technician that was collecting the DNA was using cotton swabs. The cotton swabs were made in a factory by a woman who was not wearing gloves. 50,000 of their cotton swabs that they were been issued to collect DNA with were contaminated with this woman's DNA. So the results that they got didn't match their killer because it matched some poor lady working in the factory that had no idea and had never been anywhere near. So that's a classic case of, and troubleshooting that must have been interesting, let me tell you, trying to figure that one out. As a technician in my lab, what I'm worried about is I'm actually not worried about contamination with human DNA because I'm not looking for human DNA. PCR works by you introduce a primer, or basically a starter for DNA, and then that builds the DNA strands that you're looking for. And if you don't start with a primer that's specific to human, you're not going to amplify human DNA. My lab, we're looking for ruminant DNA, we're looking for porcine DNA. We don't want to test for human DNA because a lot of our material is sourced out of China and we don't want to know.
Wow.
So I don't have to worry about contaminating with my DNA, but if I worked in a forensic lab and I were trying to amplify human DNA, it's Locard's principle. You shed. Everything that you touch, you leave a contact with, and everything that you touch leaves a contact with you as well. But, I mean, we shed skin cells, and with amplification of DNA, hair is less of an issue because it's only mitochondrial DNA in hair, unless you actually pull it out by the root. So shedding hair is not as much of a contamination concern. Skin cells are, because you can actually amplify even from a dead skin cell, because you can amplify from very, very little. You can, in theory, amplify from what's called touch DNA. I don't take a drink out of this. I've just picked it up and put it back down, and now somebody's collected that. And in theory, from my fingerprints, you can amplify enough DNA to identify me. I say in theory, because let me run this scenario by you. You've got a dead body in a sleazy hotel room. Good luck. Yeah, you're gonna get a lot of hits, and good luck proving that that hit belonged to the actual killer and not some random dude that was there 2 weeks ago. So touch DNA is very rarely even attempted to be collected because you have to know where to find it to collect it. If someone shed a skin cell at a crime scene, they do the whole thing with vacuuming on TV, but it's messy. You wind up with a mess. And you're not going to wind up with being able to prove that that DNA was left during that time scenario.
One of the things, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think I'm wandering, but yes.
No, you're good. One of the things that strikes me too is, I'm just going to say this rather than ask a question. DNA is part of a whole case. There are not very many cases where that's the one piece of evidence. That's very dramatic, but you're usually looking for someone and looking to prove they were there. Or you're looking to work back from it through something like JED Match to say who was there. But you have an idea, even the touch DNA case. If you, for example, let's say the doorknob was cleaned yesterday because you have security footage of the janitor doing an extra good job in wiping it down. All right, that might justify looking for touch DNA on it because your security camera also shows you that the masked person dragged a screaming person into that room and didn't have gloves on when they opened the door. Okay, maybe that's good, but you wouldn't generically test for it because, again, 2 days per sample, and you don't know which of 100 people have been in that hotel room. So everything is in a context of other evidence. We think this person did it because of their DNA, but we also think because they are physically tall enough to have carried the person over this railing, or they have other physical characteristics or mental characteristics, they've lived in the area, whatever it is, there's something else usually that ties them to the case.
And something that I was taught, and please feel free to correct me because I didn't get to go that route, but I was also taught that the district attorney, the prosecutor's office, and we were actually taught by a deputy prosecutor in one of my classes. They will decide whether or not they're going to go forward with a case, and part of what they evaluate before they go take a case to trial is the DNA, or not the DNA, sorry, the evidence. And if they don't feel that there's sufficient evidence that is going to win at trial, they might choose just not to follow through with it. There are a number of cases where solving the murder and getting the killer taken to justice took years because the DA, they knew who it was almost right away, but there wasn't enough evidence, so the DA was like, I don't want to do this because we're just going to lose, and then we don't have an opportunity to go after him at a later date when we might have more evidence. So it's entirely conceivable that you might have a DNA match in a case, but if that's the only piece of evidence you have, the prosecutor may say, no, we're not doing that. We need more. Because it's a whole portfolio, and the more there is, the better.
It's a personality thing too. Prosecutors hate to lose.
Yes.
Even more than other lawyers, they hate to lose.
Yes.
And so they won't play if they don't think they can win. People throw out, I think this was written by a defense attorney. People throw out things like, the numerical statistical matches that PCR shows you. 2 that match are 1 in a million, but there's 330 million people in the United States. How do you address that? How does forensics address that?
If you get a DNA match that's only 1 in a million, I would not use it in trial. Because that means that they do not have enough markers in common to individuate your things.
Very nice. Good. Take that, defense attorney.
So, generally speaking, when you're looking at a true match for DNA, the numbers are astronomical, literally. It's like 1 in 17 trillion or 1 in 4 billion is as far as the statistical probability of there being more than one person with this DNA. The funny thing is, fingerprints, we don't actually require, so when you're matching up DNA, you've got the markers and you need to have so many of them that line up before we're willing to accept it and say, okay, this is a true match, we're going to accept this. The fingerprints, they have gone to trial with as little as 3 points in common. That is not enough. But because of how our evidence rules go with a couple of cases, a couple of names I'm going to throw at you to jot down and look up are Frye, it's F-R-Y-E, and it's actually a case, it's an abbreviation for, but it has to do with evidentiary law and what's allowed to be admitted is in trial as evidence. And the other case name is Daubert, D-A-U-B-E-R-T. And Frye and Daubert happened at different times. They say different things. This is going way off from the DNA, but it is very important if you're going to be writing like procedural legal fiction to understand Frye and Daubert before you start to try and write trial.
Particularly in a science fiction context, if you're trying to introduce new science, Daubert is the primary means we have of defining an expert and what credibility they have to have before their testimony. And your forensic scientist is an expert, and that she has to be qualified. Now, the defense can say, well, you got your forensic degree from Podunk U, which has been decertified for 5 years, or whatever. Or you're the person up in New York who just simply stamped the same results into every result.
There was a gal in Massachusetts.
That's the one I'm thinking
that falsified thousands and thousands of results because she was being paid off by the prosecutors. And it takes me off because, I mean, she set the whole thing back by, I don't know, I mean, it's just like...
Every one of those convictions can now be reopened. And will be reopened.
Oh, yes, that's what they should be.
Yeah, and in at least some of those cases, that really was the bad guy, and now the bad guy's going to go free. In other cases, there's someone, poor soul, who's been sitting in a cell who shouldn't be there. So neither way you slice it.
And that's another use for DNA technology as well, is it's being used by things like the Innocence Project, and I'm sure that you've all seen a news article on this, because they generally get a lot of buzz when they get someone released. So they have actually been able to prove that people that have been in prison, in some cases been in prison for a very long time, that they didn't do what they were convicted of having done. So, but we were talking about the admissibility of new science, and most people, DNA evidence, it's a predominant thing, is such a big thing in crime and forensic evidence right now, but it's only been accepted and admissible since 1987. So it's relatively new. But every time we do some big new science and change, we have to prove to a judge that they should accept what we're saying, and we're not pulling these numbers out of thin air.
You remember that science revolves around the ability to reproduce the result and the review of it by other scientists. And what will happen if you bring new science into a case is the defense attorney will go find a scientist who says, you've made a mistake. That's the kind way of saying, you're an idiot scientist who should be booted out of the profession. You're peddling junk, and so it's a adversarial system even over the science, because science, there's a philosophical sense in which science is tentative forever, Karl Popper. There's a lot of fairly settled science like DNA and markers and so on. But when you come in with something new, they can always find someone who says, well, that's not right. And you assuming the prosecution side, but it's also great to do it from the other side, you either have to establish that it is legitimate science, this new science, or if your sympathetic party is the defendant, then you have to show that there's something wrong with the science. One of my favorite science fiction stories doesn't involve a crime story at all. It also doesn't involve any jeopardy. There's no one's at risk throughout this whole novel, and it's the science puzzle that pulls you through. The flat characters don't help, but it's called Inherit the Stars by James P. Hogan. And the reason I recommend it to you is not because it's forensic, because it's not, but it's this competition between competing theories of explaining why there's a 50,000-year-old man on the moon. And the point being that kind of scientific puzzle can itself be a dramatic driver through your story. And if you're placing it in the context of a mystery, a trial, a forensic analysis, then those competing elements of science can pull that through by itself.
So I think we're starting to edge close to the end, and I'd like to ask for questions, but before we get to that point, extrapolating out beyond where we are now, but still springboarding off of what we can do. So, does anyone recognize the term CRISPR? So, okay, so most of you do. So there was a scientist in China who was probably a lot closer linked to a certain scientist in the U.S. than the scientist in the U.S. is willing to admit at this point. He gene edited 2 babies, twin girls. The claim is that he corrected a gene in them that made them vulnerable to the HIV virus. I don't think anyone has actually seen the babies. They certainly haven't done any genetic testing on them. We don't know for sure that this happened. It is likely that he did indeed experiment on human beings, which is a violation of so many ethics that it's pretty obvious. However, Pandora's box has been opened. Gene editing is going to happen, and it will probably happen in my lifetime. And as far as what that means for DNA forensics, as we extrapolate into near future science fiction, it gets really interesting. I mean, just this last week, they encoded a computer virus onto DNA. Can you imagine a criminal that has gotten somebody to splice a virus into his DNA? So every time the law enforcement tries to test out his DNA, their entire lab crashes and it melts the instruments down. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we can take science that's happening now and push it forward into the future and have some fun with it. And I think I'd like to ask for questions.
I think let's ask for questions.
Okay, this is going to involve your favorite TV series. This morning. In one of the episodes of CSI, they were tracking down a genetic chimera.
Yeah.
I'm sure they exist.
They do.
I expect they're fabulously rare.
Yes.
And does it work the way they showed it in the TV show? And just tell us a little about it.
So genetic chimeras do exist, and actually we're finding that they may be more common. Mosaic DNA may be more common.
Would you give a little explanation?
Yes, and I'll get into that in a second. So the thing is that we're all familiar with the concept of fraternal twins and identical twins. So what we're finding is that in a lot more cases than we realized, because we used to think this was incredibly rare, Siamese twins, conjoined twins, as they're now called, will sometimes manifest as one child will completely develop and they will absorb their twin. So there's no outward physical manifestation of the second child in the womb. And that is what leads to what's called a chimera, from the mythological beast that was spliced together from all kinds of different animals, and sometimes also called mosaic, because they've actually discovered that in some cases there are people that have different patches over their body where they're not genetically really linked to each other. So as far as positing that for fiction, it's certainly is fair game as far as being scientific plausibility. It is actually a lot less rare than we assumed that it was before we started doing DNA testing on a regular basis. It's rare enough that I don't think you're going to see it pop up in a criminal case anytime soon, but we are moving to different methods of how we collect DNA as well, so that I don't think that's in reaction to that, but it's certainly a fun thing to play with. And if we did gene editing and it was only partially successful, you might wind up with a chimera from that, which gets a little freaky too. But so does that?
Yes.
Okay. So anyone else? Gosh, I must have done really well.
You fabulous. I'm fascinated by chimerism too, and it's you can think of things like, what if this is going extreme. What if you had one hand from each twin? Thinking about here's one of the classic chimera cases: fraternal twins, male and female. One survives, absorbs the other. So not every cell, this is the most obvious genetic difference, not every cell in that body is the same sex. So
that's less likely, because you have the placental barrier. So right. Chimerism is almost certainly always identical twins. So inside the womb you have the placenta that lines the uterus.
Okay. Nice.
And fraternal twins have two separate placentals and amniotic sacs. They don't share one. Identical twins share one. So they're in that really super
So take my
contact.
idea off the table.
It's an interesting idea, and something that's kind of closely related to that bit is we always assume that because how eggs and sperm work as far as DNA sharing, we assume that we get more DNA from the mother and more genetic information from the mother than from the father. They're actually finding out that that's not entirely true. As the sperm travels through the vas deferens, it's picking up RNA from the father, and then that gets transmitted into the egg and becomes part of the embryo. So you can have epigenetics from the father. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with epigenetics. So There was a radical guy about the time of Darwin that proposed the original theory behind epigenetics. So that basically there was a genetic memory that could be passed down from generation to generation. And they thought at the time that they had disproved it, and they poo-pooed, and they went with Darwin's theory of evolution instead of, I want to say Lockwood, but I might be wrong. We're now finding that he was partly right. And we can indeed inherit memory of our parents and grandparents if the father of a child has had stressors in his life, famines, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, things that change his genetic makeup, that can actually be passed on to the child. It can certainly be passed through maternal lines, but we're now finding that epigenetically speaking, we're coming down from both parents into the child, and it influences them. And this isn't necessarily related to forensics and the DNA stuff, but epigenetics is just really freaking cool. So,
Question on that, is that
Yes.
just your direct parents, or could it be like grandparents?
yes, they've done some studies on, and that's why I brought up famine in particular, is they were looking at some small group populations in Scandinavian countries where they found that after a period where they basically were starving, the children, even I think 4 generations after that, bore the genetic markers that they would expect to see from that kind of stress.
Which becomes really intriguing when you consider the supernatural concepts of prior lives. That may actually be a physical phenomenon.
Well, it's
that
like
you have memories.
yeah, and we do have genetic memories. I mean, they're not fully coherent, cognizant memories, but we certainly bear the marks of, I hate to say this, 'cause it's so, I don't like it in a lot of ways, but the sins of the fathers. And it's kind of startling and astonishing that all this that we're still learning and still finding out. And I told a friend earlier today, biochemistry is messy and it never does what you want it to do, and it's amazing stuff. So.
I think, do we have one more question? And if not, we'll just close it there. Do we have one more question? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.